This week, we're fortunate to be able to have Louis Cohen, founder of DLX Law, on the podcast. Anyone who follows Louis on Twitter, in his numerous written works, or in his conference appearances knows that he is very thoughtful in the digital asset space. This episode was going to be originally all about the Reeves Test for determining whether a note is not a security and how it relates to crypto lending programs. But after reading his article on the path forward for DeFi in the inaugural issue of the International Journal of Blockchain Law, I realized that I would need to do both topics and to endeavor to tie them all together. Reeves is actually covered later in the episode. Louis contemplates a direction forward for DeFi that I agree with, and I think we'll be saying in retrospect it was inevitable. Regulators will want regulated intermediaries, and DeFi has none. So that basically means that it becomes an effective tool for regulated intermediaries in the future that Louis envisions, as well as endeavoring to have a place for unpermissioned or non-permissioned uses of DeFi, the peer-to-peer. It's a compelling question as to whether giving the regulators and policymakers what they want actually achieves the goals of financial inclusion and egalitarianism. If policymakers and regulators insist that the existing regulated intermediary infrastructure is the only acceptable means for regulating DeFi, or for DeFi's existence, then, as Louis notes, it's no longer going to be DeFi, but just automated finance, and perhaps improved by its short stay in the DeFi sandbox. The answer for this, of course, depends on who you ask. In this episode, we do explore the new likely emerging paradigm for DeFi and its regulation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you enjoy it, click on the link and hit share on your mobile phone. I want this podcast to hit the ears of those who will appreciate it, and surely you must know someone. And yes, I am talking to you. Anyway, thank you so much for being my audience. And with that, I bring you this week's episode with Louis Cohen. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a weekly podcast featuring discussions exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel. I've spent decades representing regulated exchanges, broker-dealers, investment advisors, and all manner of fintech companies for all things touching electronic trading, with a focus on new and developing technologies. All right, this is Eric Hess with The Encrypted Economy, and today I'm really excited to have Louis Cohen from DLX Law Firm on the podcast. Louis, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be here.
So, Louis, can you give maybe a little more background about why you think maybe a small boutique law firm might be in some ways better positioned than even some of the larger firms to address what's, the digital asset issues and what's going on there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric, because I gave a lot of thought to that while I was I was a partner of two very large law firms who are excellent firms, and they have, excellent practices in this area. But what became clear to me was that if you wanted to advise enterprise grade clients in the space, you also had to take on some of the newest startups and the smallest clients that are really difficult to handle and manage in a large firm environment. I like to say you got to get your toes in the mud and really squish around a bit. And large law firms just aren't built to handle clients like that, matters like that, and engagements like that. And I realized that, there was a spot in the market for very experienced lawyers who had the ability and willingness to deal with startups and new things and stuff that didn't always make complete sense, and then apply those learnings to our larger, more enterprise type clients. And I feel very fortunate at DLX Law that we've established a client base that really ranges from, Fortune 100 type companies all the way down to single person, 20-year-old, hey, I've got an idea things, and a lot of stuff in between. And I think that is a real advantage of being a more boutique type law firm.
Yeah, I think when you're particularly in a developing area like digital assets, if you're trying to shape the space or shape your participation in it, it's easier to do if you can effectively control it. I often ask my guests to share something personal, a personal experience that helped define sort of who you are, something a little bit about yourself, maybe a singular event that just shaped you as an individual.
Sure. I mean, for that, I would say growing up on relatively modest means in New York City, in a difficult time for the city. New York City is an incredibly eclectic place at all times, but when I was a kid in the '70s, it was a really kind of wild place, and yet a lot of people doing a lot of different things. Some of them made sense, some of them made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I think early on, I developed a tolerance for the creativity that comes out of, look, you're in a place where some people are brilliant and crazy, and some people are crazy and crazy. And I think when you get to crypto, you see some of that too. So I think that was really formative for me, I would say, Eric.
Excellent. And getting back to the question, actually, let's get into your background and pretty much what led you into creating what I guess I would call would be a boutique practice focused on digital assets.
Sure. So I think really the signal point for me professionally was being involved in the area of securitization and structured finance. And, I was privileged to kind of ride the wave up as securitization sort of took over the world, first the credit markets and then pretty much everything in 2004, 5, 6, 7. And then, of course, to watch the utter devastation that the failures in that space caused, throughout the country and throughout the world. And there are a lot of important takeaways that I think folks in the crypto space can take from that in terms of innovation and its potential negative consequences. I got involved in the crypto and as we called it back then, blockchain and DLT spaces back in 2015, because I felt like this was an area where we could do better. And I continue to feel that way. But at the same time, an absence of learning lessons from what was ultimately behind the financial crisis, can lead to bad results. Crises never look the same as the last one, but I think it's important to learn from that. So, that's really what brought me in here. I couldn't be more excited about the space, but also I bring a certain level of, cautiousness because of what I did experience, being really very directly involved in the events that occurred in 2008, 9, 10.
Yeah, I can share some of that experience. I was over at Lehman Brothers at the time,
Yep.
so they might have had something to do with it. I left actually a month before that happened. So anyway, but I did kind of know. So anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about your recent article you published with Alexander Lipton, DeFi, A Pathway Forward. It was published in the International Journal of Blockchain Law, their inaugural edition. So congrats on that.
Yeah.
In that, there was a quote. You said, regulators should find ways, and I'm paraphrasing, both formal through rulemaking and informal through the regular flow of supervisory dialogue, of incentivizing the development and operation of permission access points, UIs, to the many protocols developed for use in DeFi. So there's a lot to unpack here, obviously. That's why you wrote the article. But let's just start off with sort of a retrospective. So if you had to issue a report card, I warned Lewis like 2 minutes before we started this podcast. So fair and unfair, right? Like I gave him some warning, but really not all that much. So if you had to issue a report card on both the informal and informal to date, I'll ask you the questions in order. Which regulators would you grade?
Sure. No, it's a good question, and we should all think about that. We live in a world where we are evaluated, whether we like it or not. If we're in private practice, we're evaluated by our clients. If we're in government service, we're evaluated by our stakeholders. If we're policymakers, we're evaluated by the electorate. So we're all evaluated, and I think we shouldn't be shy from expressing opinions and receiving them honestly and openly. I think at this point, Eric, you've got to give folks at best an incomplete. Attempts have been made, and I think we have to be sympathetic. And as someone who's been around financial markets for a long time, I really am sympathetic for the difficult job regulators have here. We forget sometimes that regulators are very talented people who often could be making quite a lot more money in the private sector. They're there because they care and they want to help. Sometimes, their positions in the public sector and the regulatory sector may make that difficult. difficult. But it is important to bear in mind these are folks that are trying to do good work. Particularly when you look at the SEC, the work that the FinHub team led by Valerie Stepanek has been superlative, and they're really making efforts. I think the question really is how much more can be done. It's kind of an incomplete so far. I'd love to see a way that staff both at the SEC and at the CFTC and other regulators can not only create sort of an open door policy, but actually help drive change. And it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not the job of regulators to deliver solutions. It's the job of market participants and their counsel. But I would like to see more, particularly what we speak about in the article, Eric, is the idea that I assert fundamentally, DeFi as a concept is not something that's going away. People have developed tools that allow DeFi to exist, and people have shown that they want to use those tools. They like it. They like having completely sovereign financial relationships, at a distance without trust among persons. And that is a very, very, enticing thing to many people. At the same time, there is a much wider universe, in my view, of people who are willing to accept a certain level of trust in their relationships. They are happy to delegate parts of their financial lives. What regulators can do a better job of is starting to sort of distinguish between those two groups, rather than sort of seeking to shut down people who are having what in many cases are unequivocally legal and valid economic relationships privately between two peers, and rather attempting to stop that behavior to get at a relatively smaller percentage that are violating the law. What I'd love to see, and my co-author, who's amazing, Alex Lipton. If you don't know Alex in the space, please go track down some information about him. But he's fantastic. What both Alex and I would like to see, as you cited in the quote, Eric, is regulators like sitting down again, formally and informally, and saying, "Sure, look, DeFi is out there, and when we find examples of people using it wrongfully, we're going to prosecute. However, we recognize that folks are going to use that. Instead, let's look at the analogy of iTunes, right? File sharing is still, a thing using various tools, but the iTunes store and then subsequent other services like Spotify demonstrated that permissioned use of downloading music is something many people are very happy with. And I think we'll see that with financial arrangements as well. The DeFi tools that many of us know and love, I believe will continue and should continue, but regulated financial institutions and other new market entrants can now start to create versions of these tools that are permissioned and allow a greater level of compliance for regulated entities or people managing money on behalf of others that cannot work in a purely anonymous DeFi environment.
So, Louis, do you think that the regulators might be more constrained by, and I'm not picking on Chairman Gensler, but on a chairman that's probably more politically motivated, both publicly, and I guess within the agency, than his predecessors? Do you think that constrains the ability of the staff to sort of, they have to now sift through public statements that are generally hostile toward digital assets? Do you feel that sort of complicates their ability to engage in that constructive dialogue?
It's a really good question. I think when you look at the situation overall, from my perspective, there's really one core question at issue here, and that is not whether or not most new issuances of digital assets meet the kind of Howey test in our securities, which has been the SEC's position pretty much since Clayton and through Chair Gensler. I don't think either the commissioners or the staff have been wrong-sided about that. I think the question really has to do with the digital assets themselves. I've written a lot about that, as you know, Eric, and this is where I think my views do differ a bit from those of the commission. The commission has maintained, without being particularly clear about it, that after a investment scheme has been sort of launched through a sale transaction, that scheme kind of follows the digital asset around, kind of like a bad penny, until at some point it no longer does, with the important caveat that it might come back one day when you're least expecting it, and that position was sort of codified, as it were, in this idea of sufficient decentralization, the idea that a scheme follows an asset around until some point as the whole project is sufficiently decentralized, then it's no longer a scheme. The asset itself is no longer a security. And then later, if for some reason the whole project re-centralizes, then the asset becomes a security again. And I think that's well intended, but just an incorrect reading of the law. I'm not aware of case law that supports the idea that an asset independently can sort of be the means by which an investment scheme is transported. And the reason it's important to understand this is because, and I know you want to talk a little bit about the Reeves test. I think the Reeves test provides an incredibly important contrast. Assets, be they digital assets or paintings or any which other thing, earthworms have been used. There have been a myriad of assets that have been part of investment schemes. Yet the problem is when those assets are sold and resold, it is not apparent, and frankly, it cannot be apparent to the purchaser of the asset whether that asset is transmitting a scheme, whether it's the embodiment of the scheme, or whether it's not. The SEC themselves, ironically enough, have made this clear in any number of their writings, including in some of the briefs that they've filed, where they note that you cannot evaluate whether an investment scheme is or is not present simply by looking at the contractual documents. You have to look at all the facts and circumstances, statements, implied things, all sorts of stuff. And that's fair, and I agree with that. But third parties who are purchasers of an asset cannot do the kind of forensic investigation that the SEC can do. So it's simply not possible, and nor is it practicable, to apply a doctrine that says an asset carries with it a scheme. I think there are better ways of getting at that, and I think hopefully we'll see some introduced into the public discourse before too long, because the SEC is right to say, and this is I absolutely concur, that more and better disclosure is needed when funds are raised through investment schemes where assets are sold that become widely traded. So I think we agree with the SEC on a lot. It's the means by which the policies, which are right, are implemented, and they make all the difference in the world. So I think it's less to me about a political agenda, coming back to the beginning of your question, and more about how you implement the law. In this case, there's just too little, in my humble personal judgment, too little reading of the law here, and too much, grandstanding around politics in all directions. Everybody has responsibility for that. I'd like to, let's be lawyers. Let's read cases. Let's do analysis, and let's get that kind of stuff done.
And so, as it relates to the U.S. market, does that construct effectively force the adoption of more securitized token offerings? I mean, after you pass through the Reg D, VC, angel investors, family offices, where you have an exemption under 504, that next step has often been viewed as, okay, a public ICO doesn't really work in the U.S., obviously. Is the pathway for the U.S. to now think of that next step as a STO or a securitized token offering?
No, is my short answer. And I'll tell you why, Eric. Because there is absolutely no reason why someone seeking to raise money in an investment scheme, be that a whiskey investment scheme or any which other thing, cannot and should not be able to do a full registration of that investment scheme or investment contract. Again, if we swap out digital asset and insert whiskey, and interestingly enough, and I'm a fan of whiskey myself, especially Scotch whiskey. Interestingly enough, there have been a number of whiskey investment schemes that have been proposed recently. If that whiskey investment scheme is a security, there's absolutely no reason why that investment scheme can't be registered with the SEC. It doesn't make the whiskey the security, even if the whiskey that's being sold is dependent on the efforts of others. So I think first and foremost, we should be able to have registered offerings of investment schemes in which an asset of any type, digital, or liquid, comes out the other side. I think the concern really is a different one. And that is, a very understandable interest in saying, how are digital asset markets regulated? And there is unequivocally a concern among a number of our regulatory bodies that right now, the limited regulation that applies to digital asset markets is insufficient. That gets into some difficult questions about what a better approach would be. But I don't believe that characterizing digital assets, which are not securities, as securities simply to get jurisdiction over digital asset markets is a good policy outcome, nor is it one I think that courts will ultimately support. I think what we need to do is focus on the law as it stands and not sort of try and squeeze square pegs proverbially into round holes. But that may require a change in the law, and we'll see how that sort of develops.
So, in the model that you envisioned in the paper of moving toward a permissioned, I guess, a non-permissioned environment, does it necessitate other precursors to for regulators to start to move toward that?
Yeah, so DeFi is a very unique kind of a beast in that it really allows these automated financial arrangements. And DeFi presents two different regulatory challenges. The first is sort of financial regulatory, or money transmission sanctions orientation. In pseudonymous blockchains, we simply don't know who is participating, and there is unequivocally the potential, at least, for illicit use. The financial system has always benefited from a level of due diligence done by financial institutions. This does not mean that financial institutions have done a good job of it, and enforcement action after enforcement action against traditional financial institutions have demonstrated they haven't always done a great job, but they're at least a choke point. And I think there's a lot of fear, and we saw this in the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF's final guidance that was released about 2 weeks ago. There's a lot of concern that a world without any choke points at all is a much more dangerous place than a world with bad choke points. And I think we can all, if we sit back for a moment, understand at least where they're coming from or why they might be concerned about this. That doesn't mean that they're presenting good answers, but we can understand where the motivation for concern lies. To implement, what we thought and kind of advocate for in the article, the first step is addressing the permission side of things. And so that is the money transmission related issues, the potential for money laundering, of course, or anti-money laundering prohibitions and sanctions evasion. Permissioned actors that utilize automated automated market makers, automated lending programs, and all of that can, in theory, work just as well with permission front ends. I wouldn't call it DeFi because it's not at that point. It is got a centralized choke point. However, many of the tools could still be utilized, albeit, and I know one of the points he flagged, Eric, was liquidity. You'd really have to rebuild liquidity in that environment. But in theory, you could do that. But you rightly sort of asked, sort of impliedly, aren't there other precursors or issues that need to be addressed? And the other issue is definitely the securities law side, as I said. To the extent that the position is taken that a given digital asset, other than perhaps Bitcoin and perhaps Ether, are securities, then how do you get past the idea that all of these transactions need to take place on national securities exchanges? I think the right answer is not to treat the assets as securities, but rather to recognize that other regulatory schemes are more appropriate. So I think to fulfill the vision that the article puts forward, we need to both have a permission front end that allows AML and anti-sanction avoidance to be implemented, and a world where activities in digital assets that are not securities are not sort of regulated as if they were securities to achieve a different end. I think those are the two key elements that we do need to achieve to kind of to put forward this. But I think there's a world where regular folks use DeFi, and asset managers and banks and others use those same tools, but in more permissioned environments.
And so, in the permission context, what particular DeFi applications do you see being embraced first? Like, what's that pathway look like for traditional finance adoption?
Yeah. So right now, financial institutions are there ultimately, like we are as lawyers, to serve clients. They're not actors in and of themselves. They don't build or make anything. Financial institutions serve clients who interact with the real economy. And participants in the real economy have said there are things we can start to do in blockchain networks that are interesting and relevant to us. But in order to do them, we need to have access to digital assets in a variety of different ways, and we need to price them very, very accurately. So liquidity is a very, subtle sort of thing. It comes and goes when, kind of people least expect it. Markets allow liquidity to be attracted. And so if we're going to have, for example, tools where different kinds of digital assets are used. I'm trying to think of a good example. The one wasn't immediately coming to mind, but where digital assets are used in the real economy, then you're going to have markets that price these accurately, allow you to hedge exposures, and allow you to either dispose of or acquire those assets whenever you want at a readily identifiable price. And I think those elements of traditional finance fit well in a permission environment. You can acquire the assets, dispose of them, or hedge the risk on them in a variety of different ways through permission tools as well as through non-permission tools.
And in the context of traditional finance adopting DeFi, how do you see that changing the narrative, both from a regulatory embrace perspective? Like, how does that evolve, and does DeFi become effectively, maybe Trojan horse is the wrong word, but the way that the regulators finally start to get the pressure from the real world, like the traditional finance sector, that, hey, this is something that we need to adopt. DeFi fits very well into our infrastructure. We're the throat to choke, the intermediary. I don't know if that's what you meant by choke point, but it can either mean like a narrow choke point, which holds things up, or it can mean a throat to choke. But how do you see traditional finance's adoption of that, changing the regulatory discussion?
No, it's a great question, Eric, and I think it will change things, quite possibly dramatically, because all of a sudden things like anonymity, it's hard to say, enhancing cryptocurrencies, as Fatif likes to say, are perceived. Well, why is privacy needed? It's probably because there's some illicit activity being, going on there. So that's bad, bad, bad. But if institutions are interested in privacy enhancing assets, they're doing so for commercial reasons. They don't want the world to know what they're trading or how they're trading it. And so all of a sudden, privacy enhanced cryptocurrencies or anonymity enhanced cryptocurrencies are not a bad thing, but there's something that are essential to commercial activity. And I think we have to take another look at this. The fact is paper money evolved, somewhat haphazardly into the solution that we have today, whereby one of the main choke points on paper money is its physicality, especially as we started to eliminate higher denomination paper bills. It became just very impracticable to handle large amounts of paper. And that itself, helped, limit the illicit use of cash, not eliminate by any means, but limit it. We're going to have to find other tools, and people are working on other tools. I think you've had some folks on your show that have talked about other tools. So I think, but regulators are going to have to rethink that privacy is not necessarily an indication of illicit activity. It can be an indication of actual very legitimate commercial concerns. And hopefully that will get, folks, to recognize we just need better tools. We don't need lack of privacy. We want to encourage privacy, but to do it in a way that doesn't, raise other alarms, in terms of money laundering, money transmission illegally, or sanctions avoidance.
Right. And I think I've even heard interviews like on Zcash, which is often like on the Treasury's hit list for these privacy coins. And the point that's been made is that, just because it's a privacy coin doesn't mean that you can't collect information, doesn't mean that you can't run a DApp next to it, doesn't mean that you can't otherwise get this information. It just means that the actual transactions themselves are private. Doesn't mean that other relevant information, whether it be on the permission parties or otherwise, can't be extracted. So this distinction between permissioned and non-permissioned access, do you see the regulators sort of saying, yeah, that sounds great, petitioning the non-permission and embracing the permission?
Well, if you're a regulator and you're listening, give it a thought. I don't know. I think people have to start, if I may say, waking up and smelling the coffee, that DeFi is simply not going away. That, I often, Eric, liken this to the experiment in the United States with alcohol prohibition, between the 20s and the 30s. And, look, we managed to have a hard fork in our Constitution. We call that a constitutional amendment, right? And we had a hard fork to prohibit the use of a substance commercially that a lot of people wanted to use. And it did not work out well at all. It did not work out well at all. I think trying to outright prohibit private parties from engaging in activity that they are comfortable with will not work out. And so, what I say to regulators is focus on actual bad activity where crimes have been committed and hidden through use of DeFi, protocols. Go after those people. That's bad. Ransomware, people who hack into, hospitals. It's horrible, and that needs to be stopped. But stop, spending time going after DeFi, but recognize that the side by side should be encouraged. And how does that get encouraged? As we said, both formally and informally. Informally, particularly vis-a-vis banks, bank supervisors have a lot of sway over what banks do and don't do through quiet conversations that take place, with their supervisors. And that's a way of starting to suggest that permissioned access points is something that the regulators might look favorably on. If a bank has to expend capital to develop a new technique or acquire a business, they don't want to take, that risk unless they have some comfort that what they're doing is not going to be, get them in tremendous difficulty with their supervisory entities. So that is an informal, sort of, directional that regulators can do today, is to say, hey, look into this. This could be worthwhile. And of course, more formally, that can be done through rulemaking of different types. We don't call that in our article DeFi because it's not DeFi, and I don't want my DeFi friends, rigging me up and say, Lewis, you sold us down the river. We refer to it as automated finance, and I think it is a different thing, but it's still a very valuable thing, and it's something that I think can exist symbiotically with DeFi, because as more and more users use the protocols, there's more and more demand and more ability for smart people to come in and develop the DeFi primitives that ultimately will be the more centralized automated finance, widely used tools. And again, sort of very, very, rough analogy is through, Linux and Red Hat, sort of, having an open source and open system versus, another commercial business that sits on top of it and delivers more sophisticated tools. It's not a perfect analogy, I recognize, but just another, kind of angle on this. So I think we will see that, but it'll take a little bit of time and some willingness on the part of regulators to stick their necks out a little bit too. And we need to support our regulator friends and not, constantly denigrate them. That's not how you get people to kind of stick their necks out on your behalf.
That's true. So, and in that context, I just wonder, we recently saw SocGen doing a deal with MakerDAO, which was stunning. And I wonder if, we reach a certain point, maybe here in the US or even internationally, when you have a couple of signal players, lighthouses, so to speak, that adopt this, that all of a sudden you've reached a tipping point where everything will start to reaccelerate again. Because now all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, it's really happening, right? Like you just need one beacon lighthouse to kind of push that over the goal line. And then all of a sudden there'll be just sort of like this, oh my God, we were waiting for that signal. Here it is. We were like reluctant, and now all of a sudden we have to embrace it. But that may be the embrace of the what you call automated finance versus the DeFi. And that if and when it happens, and I suspect that there will be a tipping point where and maybe not everybody will be aware of it, but there'll be, meaning it won't necessarily be broadcast, but you might find a lot of institutions simultaneously moving into automated finance and striking these deals in a hurry. Does the non-permissioned side get trampled in the process?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a real question. It is a real risk. And look, part of what draws so many people to DeFi is the fact that it is the not only is it decentralized finance, but it's sort of the opposite. It's contra finance. It's all the things that many of us don't like about traditional finance: the stuffiness, the conservatism, the sort of idea that the rich get richer and everybody else, kind of has to make do for their own.
Rent
And
extraction.
yeah, absolutely. And so recreating that is not something I'm necessarily promoting at all. I'm only saying that, we need a balance, and we're not going to have a world that exists without financial institutions. I think we can all recognize that. Financial institutions can and do serve a purpose. We can encourage the ones that do a better job and discourage those that don't. But I think we've got to have a balance. And in that balance, I think StockGen, to your example, Eric, is doing incredible work in sticking their neck out, right? Doing exactly what we said, and say, well, look, let's give it a shot. It's a small project, but let's see what happens when we use Maker in this way. So I think they're absolutely to be commended. There is some work on the legal side, particularly here in the US, that needs to be addressed. And I think you may have had one or both of Carla Reyes or Drew Hinkes on your show before. I can't
Andrew.
recall. Yeah, Drew. Yeah, and they're both terrific. Both of them are very actively involved in an effort through the Uniform Law Commission to amend our state laws regarding commercial transactions to recognize functionally digital assets, which are defined under a new draft law. As controllable electronic records. I'd love to see that project continue to move forward very swiftly. That will help address a lot of foundational legal issues about, sort of an instrument that is natively digital. Right now, we don't really have a good way of addressing that. And so that is, it will not stop the effort to integrate traditional finance and decentralized finance, but it does slow it down because there are some really, core legal issues there in terms of documents and the need for paper in some way or another, or at least a PDF in a traditional way. So I think we will make progress. I think SocGen in Europe is doing great work, and we need other banks to kind of get on board and start doing, some small scale experiments. And they're out there. We know of some. I'm sure there are more than we know of. And it's a really exciting time to be a lawyer in this space, right? Because we just have the incredible opportunity to work on some really cutting edge things. We need more folks like SocGen doing that kind of work. Definitely.
So to change gears a little bit, you mentioned Reeves before, and yes, I did want to talk about Reeves a little bit on this podcast. This podcast has covered the Howey test before, starting back with Gary DeWall and covering again with Mark Boyron and a number of others, which I'll throw into the show notes. But we haven't really touched on the Reeves test. So I'll turn that over to you to kind of like introduce what the Reeves test is and when is it used versus Howey test, and when are both used or appropriate.
Boy, it's this is if I could do this in sort of 5 minutes or less,
You have
please.
6 minutes. Don't worry. We
Well,
extended it.
then we're all good to
20%.
go. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So Reeves addresses a very different issue from Howey. In the case of Reeves, it was addressing the question of when a note is a security. And it's completely different because a note is a type of financial instrument that is well understood. And the term note, that four-letter term, appears both in the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and the Securities Act of 1933 as an enumerated security. So, right there, we are dealing with a very different type of situation. When you see something that is, as a matter of state law, a note, the question arises, is it the type of note that should appropriately be characterized as a security? Both the 33 and 34 Acts make clear that the various defined terms are securities unless the context otherwise requires. And the whole battle that ultimately led to the Reeves case was on when the circumstances otherwise require. The difference between Howey and Reeves is nobody labels anything an investment contract. So you have no way of discerning where an investment contract is, whereas notes are labeled notes, or they're readily identifiable as notes. And so the question that courts struggled with really since the 33 Act and 34 Act were adopted was when should a note not be a security? And over time, there were three different circuit-based tests. The primary test by a long measure in most most circuits before Reeves, was known as the commercial versus investment purpose test. So it was a very straightforward sort of test. Is the note something, that's more of a commercial in nature or more investment in nature? And you were supposed to sort of figure that out best as you could. And if it was more investment in nature, then it was a security. If it's more commercial in nature, it was not. A couple of states had used a risk capital test, which is, well, it's not really how the note is used, it's how the proceeds are used. If the proceeds are being used in a certain way to provide risk capital for a business, then that should be considered a security, regardless of how widely the note is disseminated or other factors. And then finally, the Second Circuit was sort of stood alone with what it referred to as the family resemblance test, yet a third way of answering the question, when should a note not be a security? And in the Reeves court ultimately adopted the Second Circuit's approach and said, well, let's look at, I think it was about 5 or 6 different types of notes that, at least according to the Second Circuit and ultimately the Supreme Court, were definitely not securities. And those were sort of private notes in private context, notes in the connection of a mortgage financing, and other sorts of things. Let's look at those and then ask, is this note one of those notes? And if it is, well, then it's not a security. Good to go. If it's not one of those specific things, does it bear a family resemblance to one of those specific things? And then it gave you a bonus 3-part test, thank you, Supreme Court, for another test to apply. And so you can guess this didn't really resolve things adequately. The main difference, though, between Reeves and Howey is that when market participants see a note, they are on notice that they could well be dealing with a security. And so they have the ability to evaluate at that point and take sort of precautionary steps to deal with the instrument as if it might be a security. And so although, when a note is or is not a security is a problem, it's nothing like the kind of problem that the investment contract or Howey test presents, because it's self-evident from a note. If I may add one subtle detail, the two definitions of security in the 33 and 34 Acts are very similar, and courts have repeatedly said they should be read as if they are functionally the same, and that's all well and good, but the 33 Act has an additional 3 words which are not in the 34 Act, and that's evidence of indebtedness. And so one does have to ask oneself, why did the Supreme Court, Congress, forgive me, why did Congress include evidence of indebtedness in the 33 Act alongside the word note? Clearly, evidence of indebtedness had to be something other than note. And so that does raise some issues, which I don't think we need to go into here, as to what exactly those words mean, if they mean anything at all. It's important also, since we're speaking to a lot of lawyers here, Eric, that people remember that the posture of the Reeves case was actually a 10b-5 case. A farmers cooperative had defaulted on a note. Their financial statements had been audited, and the audit potentially had deficiencies. And the question was there material misstatements or omissions made in the sale of a security under the 34 Act? So the Reeves case never even touched upon evidence of indebtedness as a defined term. Also in Reeves, it was actually a note. In fact, it just looked like a note. But I think these are some important things just when lawyers are going back and reading the case to think about as you go. So I don't know if that was 6 minutes, but hopefully it's reasonably punchy.
So let's actually link the Reeves test back to DeFi, because DeFi, we talked a little bit about the trading of digital assets on DeFi, but DeFi is obviously so much more than just trading. There's also opportunities to create lending arrangements. I mean, people might package it the same way. People might say, well, that's an NFT, whatever. But ultimately, there's this notion of trading as almost like there's something of utility that we're trading, but then there's also leveraging it for lending purposes. Or how does the Reeves test either facilitate the model that you're anticipating in terms of permission, non-permissioned, or is it something that, when you think of this model, it's not necessarily one of the first areas you think is going to be embraced?
Well, in pure DeFi, there are no nodes, so that's a good starting point. A node is an instrument, and that's why it sort of turned out to be useful that I was talking about the Uniform Commercial Code. A node is written on a piece of paper, so an instruction given to a network computer of computers, which is all a token is simply not a node. So there are no nodes. There may or may not be evidences of indebtedness, and that's an interesting and challenging question of which there's very little case law. I think as a principles basis, though, I think there are concerns about how do we understand our securities laws in the context of activities that occur in DeFi, and I would say that's an emerging discussion, which we should have. I think a point has been made frequently by some of the larger lending platforms that we loosely use the word lending, but this is not lending that happens on these platforms in the traditional sense of I don't have enough money because I'm here at the bar and I drank too much whiskey, and at the end of the night I say, Eric, can you spot me a 50 or something, man? Because I don't want to wash the dishes tonight, and you lend me the money. That's lending. A bank might lend a customer money to buy a house. Auto manufacturer might lend somebody the money to buy a car. The lending occurs, generally speaking, when someone who doesn't have enough money and wants to do something, gets money today, which they will repay through economic activity in the future. That's not what occurs on these platforms today, as I think people who know DeFi understand. Rather, these are more different types of exchanges where you may lock one digital asset in a smart contract and be given access to another digital asset. I'd argue that that's not necessarily lending. In fact, it's probably not lending at all. It's another type of activity, and the law needs to catch up with how we appropriately characterize that activity. But it is very different from lending, and certainly it's not a note in almost every case. Query whether it's an evidence of indebtedness. That's its own thing.
But in classifying some of the what I would call DeFi applications that actually seek to leverage, I would say, not the model that you referenced of locking one digital asset necessarily to get another one, right? You look at dApps like Centrifuge or Tin Lake, or even maybe some of the RWA real world asset initiatives of Maker, which may or may not, I wouldn't necessarily fit in the same category as Centrifuge and Tin Lake. Do you see those types of models gaining adoption in the permissioned, unpermissioned, or non-permissioned space that you're talking about? And maybe we should define a little bit what Centrifuge and Tin Lake is doing, but basically facilitating lending for real world assets. Where basically, it could be a house, it could be anything. You borrow the money, and then you're basically there's a pool of participants that put money into it. So I'll kick that one over to you to sort through.
Eric, it's a fantastic question, and it's almost like we planned it, but we didn't. From starting off talking about the financial crisis, so one of the most central products in the financial crisis, really, that many things sort of wound up revolving around, was called asset-backed commercial paper, and you're probably familiar with this product. And so it became very, very, very enticing.
Lehman did a little bit with it.
Yeah. It became very, very enticing to effectively borrow short and lend long. So when you borrow for a very short duration, typically the financing rate is very low. When you lend for a long duration, typically the return is relatively higher. And so this maturity transformation, as regulators refer to it, became a very intoxicating kind of tool for financial institutions who replicated this over and over and over again, in particular financing 30-year mortgages with 30-day commercial paper. I think, without commenting specifically, some of the real world asset plays do need to be really careful and mindful that they're not replicating some of the problems of the past by financing longer term assets, particularly assets that may become illiquid in many of the same ways that subprime mortgages became illiquid, with effectively short-term IOUs from tools like Maker. So I think those are projects that I would say really need to be very, 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 very careful about what they're doing.
Right. So from that, I take it that that is not where you see the first adoption coming. That probably needs more regulatory oversight and thoughtfulness as in the context of institutions adopting it. Because arguably, if institutions adopt it, it'll just accelerate those balance sheets, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, in complete fairness, that obviously, as you alluded to before, what SocGen did through their Forge sort of business unit was financed through Maker, and in some ways, it does fall into that category. I think you need to be really careful in doing it. I think it is exciting, and I think conceivably it can be done in ways that are appropriate, but it's not an area in which we just hey everybody, let's pile on the party and buy a Bored Ape. It's not that kind of thing at all. That's not where you want Chad to be going. Send Chad somewhere else, please. There's a lot of risk associated with that
Yeah,
activity.
and when it starts going into institutional adoption, then you get into the fancy financial engineering, right?
Absolutely, that's right. Those are not things that you want to mix for sure.
Right. Um, so this has been an exciting discussion. Are there any things that we didn't touch on that maybe in the context of your article or in the context of the discussion that maybe you thought we should kind of explore a little bit more?
Yeah, not quite, because I don't think we touch on NFTs directly in the article, but I do want to give a shout out to the world of NFTs, and not just because sort of it's the hot thing today. I'd actually tweeted about this. I was very very proud of this. I think back in like 2017 that NFTs were really the beginning of the blockchain era, and that's because and Eric, you've probably heard me say this before. If we are in the kind of crypto blockchain community or get past the regulatory hurdles that we see before us as looming so large, the way I kind of put it is my sort of pithy little way of saying is we have to win the Thanksgiving table. What does that mean? We have to get real folks who are not in the crypto bubble that we live in to sort of say, wow, digital scarcity makes sense to me. I feel like I can do something that I couldn't have done before because of it. And as a result, I'm actually either creating new economic activity or engaging, or my life is better in some way or another, not just because number go up, which is not a bad thing. But we need to get, those folks beyond the crypto bubble. NFTs really are the way to do that, to introduce people to the idea of digital scarcity. Public blockchain technology is absolutely essential to the very concept of NFTs, that you can own something through a public record that everyone can see and can be transferred smoothly and easily without trust. As more people sort of understand what NFTs can do and start to expand the way they engage with NFTs, more people are downloading MetaMask, they're getting engaged, they're owning Ether. Now they're figuring out what Solana is. Oh, that's better, that's worse. They're using side chains. Now they've sort of owned some crypto and they want to hedge it a little bit. And they're coming into the world of digital assets in the right way because they're using it for some productive activity. I'm particularly excited by projects as sort of obtuse as Loot, in which people sold NFTs with just words, lists of words that were designed to be creative, other things on them. I'm excited about projects where some of the Bored Apes are being used to generate whole new kind of worlds of stories and different things. The crypto fungi, whatever they're called, are doing incredible things. There's all these projects now that are just driving creativity, and ultimately that will redound to the benefit of DeFi and these financial things, because that's why this stuff matters. Otherwise, it's just a big sort of internal game that we're all playing with ourselves. When crypto is used outside of this small bubble, that's when we win. That's when regulators will start to say, not how do we stop this, but how do we help this grow and develop? And I think we'll get there. So maybe my parting words, Eric, from my end are like this Thanksgiving, like let's have those conversations, and hopefully we start to see, regulators, policymakers, and others like listening to nieces and nephews talk about all the reasons they're excited to be in the crypto space and all the ways that they can't wait to see what 2022 brings. And I think as those conversations happen, we will be in a really exciting and amazing place, next year.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with you on the NFTs. I think it's often said that innovation is overvalued in the short term and undervalued in the long term. There might be a hype cycle associated with NFTs, but in the long term, it has tremendous value, and we've only scratched the surface. And Loot's a very intriguing example because it is truly generative versus, requiring you to access it from a server. So Loot is sort of unique. People look at it like, I didn't get Loot initially. I was like, it didn't make any sense to me. But once I got it, I was like, oh my God, it is revolutionary. It's like CryptoPunks back in the day, and it's how revolutionary it is. Unfortunately, I'm a little too late to figure that one out, right? People are.
There'll be others. And maybe tying us all the way back to the very beginning of our conversation. Yeah, I file that under good crazy. I'm finally getting around to listening to the Barack Obama book, and he talks about, kind of good crazy and bad crazy, and we need more good crazy, and Loot's good crazy. And, I think blockchain and digital assets and crypto is driving good crazy, and we need a lot more of that kind of creativity in the space, and more folks just to get involved and bring your good crazy, please.
Well, I don't know how I can top that for a closing remark. So, Louis, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it.